So it looks like we have about 60 people right now, and maybe a few others will join us. Um, my name is April Warren, if I haven't met you. I lead the Clean Cooking Alliance's User Insights Lab. And our User Insights Lab combines the latest thinking in consumer insights, behavioral science, and design to support industry stakeholders to deliver more value for customers at a time when we need exponential growth in clean cooking adoption. So we're very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on reducing fuel stacking in clean cooking. We as CCA have supported Dr. Tash Perros with the development of an evidence-based toolkit that generates insights to support more exclusive use of clean cooking fuels and technologies. And Dr. Perros developed and tested this toolkit using a systematic methodology that's been written up in academic journals. So we're very excited to have her here today. Tasha, if you can go to the next slide, I'll go through the agenda for today. So today we're going to cover what our fuel stacking toolkit is and why we created it, or why Dr. Perros created it, how the tool has been used by cooking companies thus far. Then we're going to do an inside look at what is required to use the tool. So really, what are the different steps that you would need to take if you wanted to implement the tool? Sort of a quick preview in case your organization wants to use it. And then we're going to leave as much time as we can for your questions. So please pop them into the Q&A as we go, and we'll review all those questions and try to answer as many as we can. Next slide, please. So before we dive in and I turn it over, there is a reason we're holding this webinar now, and that's because we have some funding to provide technical support to up to 5 companies to implement the fuel stacking toolkit. And so we're looking for tool and fuel companies that are ready to get started this year, or at least start discussions. So I'll share a bit more about that at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our primary speaker, which is Dr. Tash Perros. Dr. Perros is a researcher and consultant based at the University College London, where she's a senior fellow at the Climate Compatible Growth Program. Prior to this, she was a postdoctoral research associate with the University of Liverpool on the Clean Air Africa program, aiming to accelerate understanding of household air pollution across 5 countries in Africa. Through this, she led evaluation and research studies in Kenya, Tanzania, and Rwanda. Dr. Perros' research is grounded in the social sciences using mixed research methods. Her work centers on energy access in sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on scaling clean cooking solutions in the region. She graduated from the University of Cambridge with a master's in mechanical engineering, and she holds a PhD from University of College London. So Dr. Perros, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, April. And thank you to the Clean Cooking Alliance for giving me the opportunity to present this work today, and to everybody attending for taking time out of your busy days to come and listen to me talk. So I'm going to start by considering what fuel stacking is and why it matters. As I'm sure many of you know, fuel stacking is the practice of relying on multiple fuels and technologies to cook. And it's the reality of how most of us prepare food. So for example, I live in Edinburgh in the UK. I mostly cook on a gas stove, but I always use a kettle to boil water and a rice cooker to cook rice, because for whatever reason, it never works on a gas hob for me. So fuel stacking is, it's good. It allows us to choose the optimal appliance for a given task. And it also provides contingency if fuel prices or availability change. But in the context of clean cooking interventions, we're usually trying to introduce a clean cooking or a cleaner cooking fuel or technology to a population who are using polluting fuels like firewood, charcoal, or animal dung. And in this case, the phrase fuel stacking usually refers to the continued use of polluting fuels alongside the clean ones. And we can more accurately call this polluting fuel stacking, as I have done in the title of this slide. And I think of polluting fuel stacking as the Achilles heel of clean cooking. It happens in every single sort of clean cooking program. A clean cooking fuel or technology is never completely adopted, and it really undermines the benefits of cooking with clean fuels. Starting with the climate, so polluting fuel stacking means that those polluting fuels are still being burned. So those harmful emissions are still, being made. that then means that the negative health impacts of cooking with polluting fuels perpetuate as well, because you've still got the cooks in the household breathing in those harmful pollutants. And then finally, polluting fuel stacking also detracts from revenues of clean cooking companies, from both direct fuel sales, because it means that, the household isn't using as much of the clean cooking fuel as they could be, and also from carbon credit issuances under the metered methodology. So I just want to stop here for a second and do a little poll. So we just say on this slide for 1 second, if you scan the QR code in the top right corner, that should take you to a Menti poll. Alternatively, you can go on www.menti.com and type in the code that's sort of on the bottom left of the screen. So I'll just give you like 20 seconds to do that. Now I think I should have switched to showing you the results of the Menti poll. Can you see that? April, maybe you could unmute and let me know if you can see the right slide.
Yes, I can see the right slide.
Okay. So the first question is, how does stacking affect your business? So just going to give a few seconds for some more responses to trickle through. But yeah, increases costs, reduces carbon, reduces fuel sales. So I guess some other stuff to what was on the slide. I now flick to the next question that I'd like to ask you. I wonder how many participants on this call have actively tried to reduce stacking with alternative fuels and technologies. So largely the answer seems to be no so far. I'll just give another 10 seconds for a few more results to trickle through. Some people have tried, but maybe not so successfully. A few people aren't sure. And building upon that, if I flick to the final question that I'd like to ask. So for those of you who have tried to reduce fuel stacking, I'm just interested to know what you've tried, if you don't mind writing that down. Typing, so I'm just going to hover here for a little bit longer. Appliances, rebates, battery storage. So I guess that increases fuel supply effectively for e-cooking. Incentives, take away the baseline fuel. Interesting. Continuous monitoring, improved knowledge, multiple units. So I guess that's about allowing people to cook many things at the same time, providing access to improved cook stoves. Okay, so a few different things have been tried, but I think what we saw from the previous slide was that sometimes successfully, but more often than not so successfully. So I'm just going to flip back to my presentation. Okay, are we back to my slides, April?
Yes, but we can see your notes as well.
Oh dear.
That always happens when I'm in presentation mode. I don't know.
Okay. What if I go back here and then reshare? Can you see?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay, nice. All right, so I think what we saw through the polls was kind of what I've seen and experienced through my research, which is that there's a real disconnect between the importance of stacking and how little has been done to try and address it. So the question is, why is that? And if you speak to any behavioral scientist, they'll tell you that the first step of changing a behavior is understanding why it happens. And it turns out that fuel stacking is a surprisingly tricky practice to study. So firstly, it occurs for a really wide variety of reasons. I did a literature review of fuel stacking that I'll come on to talk about later in the presentation, but we identified 60 different drivers of why people stack. Secondly, stacking is a surprisingly complex behavior. There are often several interacting reasons why people stack, and that means that there are multiple barriers that need to be concurrently addressed in order to change that behavior and to unlock whatever it is that's stopping a customer from cooking with clean fuels. And then lastly, stacking is actually really hard to measure. So quantitative methods typically involve sticking sensors. And to get a complete picture of what's going on, you need to stick those sensors onto every stove in the household. And this is expensive, both in terms of the physical equipment that needs to be purchased and in terms of the analysis capacity to make sense of all that data. Qualitative research methods, usually household interviews, these are quite time intensive. They require really highly trained researchers who understand the topic in order to conduct those interviews well, and that makes them hard to scale up. So it's this stacking measurement gap that I've tried to address through the stacking tool that I'm presenting to you today. So what actually is the stacking tool? Well, it's a theory and evidence-based toolkit that generates insight to support more exclusive use of clean cooking fuels and technologies. The target audience is anyone whose remit involves understanding and potentially changing patterns of fuel stacking. So that could be private sector companies who are providing clean cooking solutions. It could be people who are involved in research and monitoring and evaluation, or it could even be funders who just want to understand what's really going on in their programs. Its purpose is to empower people to independently and comprehensively understand the various factors driving fuel stacking in their target populations, and to do so rigorously and cost effectively. And it really consists of three different elements. So at its core, the fuel stacking tool is a survey about fuel stacking. And then alongside that survey, we provided some tools to help you analyze the data, and then also a user guide to take you through how to implement it. And here I've got some visuals of these different components. So on the left, there's a screenshot of the front cover of the user guide. That contains guidance on how to implement the tool, and really a lot of the material that I'm covering in today's webinar comes from that document. The survey itself is provided in two forms. There's a Word document version, and there's a screenshot like in the top center of that. And there's also an Excel file that goes with that, which can be dropped directly into Kobo or Google Forms so that you can create, a kind of an answerable survey without having to go through all the faff of making each question individually. If you've ever used Kobo or Google Forms, which I imagine many of you have, you'll know that the data is consolidated into an Excel spreadsheet that you download once you've finished with your data collection. And what we've done is we've tried to make that data really easy for you to analyze. So we've created an Excel file, which is kind of shown bottom left. It's got a tab on it where you can drop that survey data from Kobo or Google straight into the tab. And then, that updates sort of graphs and analyses on the other tabs of the spreadsheet. In addition to that, we've created a PowerPoint presentation that links to that spreadsheet, automatically generating the graphs, and a really easy summary presentation with data visualizations for you to show to the rest of your team. And then finally, kind of top right, there's a PDF instruction manual that specifically explains how to use this analysis Excel spreadsheet and PowerPoint presentation. So I just want to explain where the stacking tool came from. Work on this started quite a few years ago now, I think in 2020 as part of my PhD. So it's been a few years in the making. There have been three major stages to its development, and I felt that it was really important to explain this process to you. Like at the end of the day, anyone can draft a survey, but the value of this tool really lies in the rigorous process that I went through in designing it. The first step of the process was a literature review of fuel stacking. So I reviewed 100 different papers and reports about clean or cleaner cooking interventions, and I sort of created an inventory of all the different reasons why people stack, which I've called a fuel stacking taxonomy. And that's the sort of 60 different reasons why people stack that I referred to earlier in the presentation. My PhD was conducted in partnership with Bbox. So they were kind enough to support me in taking this research to the next step, which was a pilot that we did together in 2022. So I used that taxonomy to design the first iteration of the fuel stacking survey. So one question of the survey more or less corresponded to one of those stacking drivers identified through the literature review. We tested the survey on 99 of Bbox's pay-as-you-go LPG users in Western Kenya. And then we used the results of that survey to design and test interventions to try and reduce fuel stacking with 19 different customers. And I'm going to explain the results of that to you in a couple of slides' time. The Clean Cooking Alliance, they saw the value in this work and they were kind enough to give me some support to drive it even further. Through the Bbox pilot, there were lots of learnings about conducting that survey. So the first step of the work with the Clean Cooking Alliance was to refine the survey tool. We then tested it with around 1,300 M-gas customers over the phone. So again, this was pay-as-you-go LPG in Kenya. And what we did this time was we also conducted some qualitative in-person interviews. And that allowed us to triangulate the results of the survey against these, really in-depth hour-long conversations that we had with people about why they stacked. And through that process, we did validate that this, quite quick 10-minute quantitative telephone survey was a really good way of understanding why people stack. And then the last part of the work with M-gas was taking all of those learnings and bundling them into the tool that I'm presenting to you today. So I just wanted to highlight the key finding of the literature review to you, which is that stacking drivers are really context specific. And here we show the context broken down by different technologies. So the diagrams, these circular diagrams, I know that they're a bit small and a bit complicated, but basically every slice of the pie corresponds to a different reason why people stack. And we saw that different technologies had these quite unique fingerprints for stacking. So maybe really unsurprisingly, LPG polluting fuel stacking was driven by affordability reasons. For improved cook stoves, this was sort of technical issues and equipment compatibility issues. So, my pot's too big to fit on this small rocket stove, therefore I can't use it. And e-cooking, fuel stacking was usually driven by fuel supply restrictions. I'm now going to talk about the Bbox pilot in depth, simply because that was the one where we actioned the findings from the stacking survey and it produced some sort of interesting results. So the table on the left shows that the survey revealed a number of drivers of fuel stacking, and we came up with several different ideas about how we could address them. We evaluated their feasibility, and in the end, we decided to trial providing Bbox pay-as-you-go LPG customers with stovetop pressure cookers and high-quality chapati pans. So the rationale behind the pressure cooker, maybe unsurprisingly, was that we found customers consistently preferred to use charcoal to cook long boiling foods like beans, basically because it's cheaper. And a stovetop pressure cooker really increases the efficiency of cooking these foods and therefore makes it financially viable to prepare them on LPG. The chapati finding was a little bit less expected. So people complained that LPG burned their chapatis. And when we looked into this in more detail, we found that people tended to use these quite thin, low quality metal bashed up frying pans that weren't really capable of distributing the heat very effectively from the points where the gas hit the pan. And that meant that it was burning the chapatis. So what we did was we sourced a number of kind of higher quality, thick bottom frying pans that could distribute the heat well. And we gave them to these customers and these participants in the trial, along with training on how to use them. And this does need to be caveated by the fact that it was a very small little intervention study, only 19 participants because we didn't have very much budget, but the results were really positive. And we found that a third of participants stopped cooking with charcoal and that there was a mean increase in pay-as-you-go LPG consumption of 16%. So the takeaway message here is that there were clear gains to be had from adopting this approach of understanding why people stack and then actioning them in like an intentional and targeted way. Moving on to the process of implementing the tool. So there are 3 stages to implementing the stacking tool, and I reckon that each of them should take a couple of weeks. So the first phase is the planning phase. This consists of some preliminary research, planning for data collection, getting all the logistics in place, and then finally adapting the survey to your specific context. Next, there's the data collection phase. So this consists of enumerator training, piloting the survey to make sure those enumerators are really familiar with it, and then finally collecting the data. And then lastly, we have the analysis stage, where you download the results, you input them into the automated analysis tools. That allows you to identify the key drivers of stacking and to identify potential interventions to try and change that behavior. So, starting with the planning phase, this consists of preliminary research and data collection, putting together a plan. And doing this will inform the sampling strategy and the adaptation of the questionnaire. So it's really important that the questionnaire is adapted to your specific context, because this will avoid wasting time and collecting unnecessary data. For example, if you're dealing with an improved cook stove project with a rural unelectrified population, there's not really much point asking if they have kettles or how often they experience blackouts, right? So you can just delete those questions from the very generalized survey that we provide in the tool. So the first step to this is to conduct some preliminary research to make sure that you've got the information that you need in order to adapt the questionnaire accordingly. And I've provided more details on this in the user guide, but just to give you some starting points, it's really helpful to already have an idea of the fuels and the stoves that people are using, so that you can be asking about the right technologies in the survey. It's helpful to know if there are any specific foods that drive stacking, because that often comes up as quite an actionable point for interventions. And this is also a really good opportunity to ask about any relevant technical issues from your fuel or stove. So it also helps to have an idea of user feedback before you get going. And generally, you might already know the answers to these questions. You might feel confident in amending the questionnaire without needing to do any additional research. I think it's always helpful to conduct a few additional customer interviews or focus group discussions, even if it's just to validate what you already know. My personal experience is that people's cooking practices can change quite quickly, especially in urban areas where there are, lots of new offerings coming in. So I would be wary of relying too heavily on insights that are more than, I don't know, a year old. They could be outdated. The next aspect is the sampling strategy. And the first thing that you really want to know is if there are any clusters that you need to consider in your sampling design. So what I mean by a cluster is like a kind of a group of participants or customers who might have significantly different cooking practices from each other. So these could relate to different geographical regions in the area where you're implementing a project. It might relate to kind of different ethnic groups who have different diets and traditions. Maybe there are differences in the business model in different places, like maybe there's a subsidy in one area which leads to lower pricing, which obviously would affect the adoption of the stove. So the first step, like I said, is to identify these different clusters. And you should treat these separately when you run the survey, because they're going to have different results associated with them. In terms of how many surveys that you need to do, our recommendation is a minimum sample size of 100 surveys for each cluster, and to randomly sample within each cluster. Now, this 100, I would regard it as a minimum. The more data you collect, the more confidence there will be in the result. So I imagine that for most people, the final sample size will actually be dependent on resources rather than hitting this minimum bar of 100 surveys. And then lastly, there's the mode of data collection. So face-to-face, telephonic, online. There are some new SMS tools coming out that are quite cool. Each of these different modes of delivery has different biases and resource allocations associated with it. And I'd recommend having a look at the user guide for a discussion of those different nuances. Okay, so armed with the information from your preliminary research, the next stage is to adapt the questionnaire to your context. I've got a screenshot of the Kobo survey on the left here. I would say the Word document is the easiest place to review the survey. And in the Word document, we've included comments and color coding to flag the questions that are likely to need deleting or amending. But be aware that if you are using the Excel spreadsheet to upload to Kobo or Google Forms, you then do need to amend that as well as the Word document. The survey itself consists of 5 different sections. So it starts with the enumerator introducing themselves and explaining the purpose of the survey to the participants. If you decide to use incentives, which you may do, more about that decision in the user guide, then you'll need to explain that to the participant as well. The very first section of questions asks about current fuel use, and this data can be used to quantitatively estimate the extent of stacking in your sample. The main section covers influences on stacking behavior, and it consists of Likert questions. So, that 5-point scale, which goes from highly agree to highly disagree. And each question is about one of those 61 different drivers of fuel stacking identified in the literature review. There are some specific questions as well about the compatibility of the sort of target technology with different foods and cooking processes. And then the survey wraps up with some final questions about the top driver of fuel stacking, because it can be really helpful to have an idea of priority, and then other reasons for stacking that the survey hasn't covered. So a bit of a catch-all at the end to see if there's anything else. There are quite a lot of questions, but they're quite quick fire. And there's a lot of conditional logic, so you don't end up going into some of the sets of questions a lot of the time. And when we did this with MGAS, we found that the average was sort of around 10 minutes per participant. So now we move on to collecting data. And this really starts with enumerator training. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of enumerator training. So even in a survey like this one, which has been designed to be quantitative and quite objective, the quality of the data is really tightly linked to the competence and also the engagement of the person who collects it. Yeah, good enumerators, they engage their participants, they're consistent, they avoid bias pitfalls, and they can spot those instances where the respondent doesn't quite get the question, and they can reframe it so that they still get the answer that you want. Key elements to be covered in the training include the motivation for the study, the informed consent process. The enumerators need to be really familiar with the survey. They need to understand why they're asking each question, and also with whatever technology they're using to administer it, whether it's a smartphone or a tablet or anything like that. They should practice on each other until they get comfortable with the questions, and then they should also do some piloting with end users, and that piloting data shouldn't feed through to your final kind of data that you've collected, so it should be kept separate. Once you've finished collecting your data, the next phase is to analyze it and to identify those main drivers of stacking throughout the sample. So as I already explained, we've included an automated Excel spreadsheet, which delivers analysis and data visualizations, and that's linked to a PowerPoint report, which pulls the data into a brief report deck. I need to sort of caveat here and say that a few slides earlier, I told you about the importance of adapting the survey to your specific context. That will ensure that you're asking, relevant questions to your target audience, but it also might mean that when you download the data from the survey, it ends up looking a little bit different to how the spreadsheet assumes. So when you drop the data into the spreadsheet, you do just need to spend a little bit of time checking to make sure that, the right columns are pulling through to the right graphs. Not too difficult, and it is explained in the PDF, guide to using this analysis tool. And then finally, it's the intervention design phase. In the user guide, we've included a table, which I've screenshotted on the left. And this suggests different interventions to tackle the key fuel stacking drivers in order to help you take the insights from the survey to the next level, in the same way that I did with Bbox. And I just wanted to say here that, at the moment, the evidence base for stacking interventions is quite scarce. Most of the research studies, they stop short at suggesting ways that stacking might be reduced. They don't actually implement them. And a lot of companies in this space are taking it a step or two further, but those learnings aren't necessarily written up and therefore shared very widely. And this is really where I would like to take this research next. So if you're interested in working with me in the Clean Cooking Alliance on that, then please get in touch. And I think there's a lot to be learned from more piloting of interventions and sharing the learnings with the community. And with that, I'm going to hand back to April.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Perros. Just before we move into questions, I wanted to come back to the opportunity that we have for support to implement the survey and use the tools. So CCA is going to fund technical support provided by Dr. Perros to up to 5 companies. And Dr. Perros will support you to determine the preliminary research that you need to do, any adaptations to the survey you might need to make. She'll help you with your data collection plan, and she can train your enumerators. And then she will also help adapt the toolkit to provide data analysis and a summary report of your results. So at the end of it, you'll have implemented the survey, adapted to your context, and you will have the full results of that. Um, we do have funding that is going to expire this year. So we're hoping to get a sense of interest and begin initial consultations as soon as possible. So that's why I put a November 22nd deadline for getting in touch. But please just reach out at any point if you have interest or questions about using the toolkit, and we're happy to respond as quickly as we can. So it looks like we have plenty of time for questions. I only see a few in the Q&A so far, so please continue to use the Q&A, not the chat, to put in your questions, and we will get to those. And if there's anything that we don't get to, we're happy to be in touch after the webinar in any way. So let me pull up the Q&A. So there's some interest in getting in touch with Dr. Perros. Okay, first question, Dr. Perros, did you also assess drivers of stacking with biogas cooking fuel?
Um, we did in the literature review, but it wasn't shown in the circular diagrams because I think I only plotted the diagrams where there were more than like 10 different studies, because otherwise it became, there just wasn't really enough data to plot them out. So yes, but they aren't shown in the circular diagrams for comparison. They are discussed in the paper, which was published in Nature Energy. I actually don't think it's open access, but if you drop me an email, I can share it with you.
Great. And then we have a question about data cleaning. So do you have a data cleaning process to register errors by the interviewer or make sense of any nonsense answers and all of that?
Yeah, we provide some support about this in the guide. Um, we haven't created an automated process for that, but yeah, I would recommend that when you start collecting the data, like you periodically keep checking it to look for nonsense answers. If you use the spreadsheets that we've provided to upload to Kobo or to Google Forms, we've kind of put constraints in there to try and minimize the nonsense answers. So, at least you can't like give an answer of 1,000 to something that ranks from 1 to 10, for example. But yeah, I would consult the user guide for this. It is really important.
Great. And just so everyone knows, the user guide is a wealth of information, and very clearly organized. So it's easy to sort of jump around if you have additional questions, but also we're happy to answer your questions directly. A question about clusters. So it says, in India, we understand that the clusters should be formed around the basis of food habits, and therefore we form clusters on a state basis. Also, if there's a partial usage, which is very common in Indian context, how should we analyze that data, the ratio of the number of meals prepared vis-a-vis the total number of meals? So Tash, I don't know, I can repeat that too if you want. I don't know if that's totally answerable right now, but do you think you can take a stab, or do you want me to repeat it?
So the first part of it was about clusters in India, and you suggested that the clusters should be by state because of different
Food habits.
food habits. Yeah, so that would be a good way of doing it. It's really difficult to provide advice on this without knowing the full picture of the situation that you're talking about. But basically, the cluster should correspond to like kind of groups within your program who you think, are going to behave differently. So yes, different geographies and food cultures definitely feed into that. And then can you remind me what the second part of
Yeah.
the question was, April?
Um, and I'm not sure if I understand this part, so let me try again. But if there is partial usage, which is very common in India, how shall we analyze the data? And there's sort of a dash ratio of the number of meals prepared vis-a-vis the total number of meals. So I think maybe that's about quantifying the fuel stacking amounts. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think so. There are lots of different ways of doing it. So one is, like you said, by um, looking at meals and the proportion of meals cooked on different fuels and appliances. I guess the challenge with that is you've got to ask people a lot about their meals. What we did in the version of the fuel stacking tool that's on the website, which we might revise actually, is we just asked people about when they last cooked with a given fuel or technology in their house, because we find that asking about frequency of meals or frequency of use creates there are kind of quite large margins of error in that. Asking when they last cooked with something kind of gives a kind of a softer way of comparing the frequency of cooking with different fuels in a way that doesn't take too long to ask. So yeah, you could do it by meals, you could try and assess it by energy, you could just do it by frequency of use, you could look at proportion of expenditure, lots of different ways of doing it. Yeah.
Great. All right. A question on whether the data collected can be used to assess the possibility of communities to switch from one form of clean cooking instead of stacking, especially in rural and low-income communities.
Um, so this question is about whether you could use the survey to assess how a community would respond to a clean cooking intervention,
Yeah, I think whether they might switch.
whether they might switch. The framing of the questions is such that it assumes that the respondent already has been given a technology that they're using at least some of the time. So I don't think you could use it completely prospectively. What it is intended to do is to study a population that's using a clean technology and understand what could be done to make them use it more. So I hope that answers your question.
And if, for anyone, if we're not fully answering your question, forgive me, I'm new to using this Q&A process, so feel free to rewrite your question or to kind of provide clarification in the Q&A and we'll come back to it. How do you prevent mismatch of serial number by the field agents?
Well, I guess that the mismatch against what, I guess, is the question. What we're doing here is a one-off survey. So I guess that the purest answer is that for the purposes of this survey, as long as you don't have the same person being surveyed multiple times, that doesn't really matter. I mean, what we did in the MGAS example was they had customer IDs assigned to each participant. So I manually took So sorry, I'm not explaining this very well. They had a big database of lots and lots of different customers. We wanted to sample, I think, 1,300 customers from that database. So we sort of ran a random sampler. We got our list of 1,300 people that we wanted to survey. I think we actually had like 2,000 because we assumed that a load of people wouldn't pick up the phone. So we had a list of 2,000 different people who we wanted to survey. And then I took that list and I divided it between the enumerators. So if there were 10 enumerators, each enumerator got given 200 different customers to speak to. And in the MGAS example, we did some additional analysis that I didn't cover in this presentation. MGAS are a pay-as-you-go LPG companies. They also have LPG consumption data. And we wanted to match the results of the survey to the LPG consumption data. If anybody's interested in the results of that, again, get in touch and I can point you towards the sort of journal article where we wrote this up. But we, at the beginning of the call, we clarified the respondent's name and their telephone number, because that was sort of the unique ID that allowed them to be matched to the customer ID on the MGAS database. And then at the end of the call, we repeated that data collection. So that meant that if there was one error in writing down the names or the numbers, we could catch it because we basically, recorded some kind of form of unique identifier 4 times. So I hope that makes sense. The very quick answer is that if you are using this survey to correlate to a customer database, I would always kind of record an identifying piece of information at the beginning of the survey and at the end of the survey, so that if there's an error, you can kind of pick up on it quite quickly.
Great. So I have one more question about like the survey tool, and then we have a few questions about kind of implications and discussion of sort of what's next once you do the survey. So on the survey tool, how do you approach seasonal variations, which could have a huge influence on fuel prices and types of meals?
Yeah, well, we ask about it, basically. It's a balance. We actually had a sort of, in the version with MGAS, there was sort of a longer version of the survey and a shorter version of the survey. And what we've shared is the shorter version of the survey because the longer one just took a long time to run through and was quite complex to analyze. So in the longer one, we asked lots of questions about seasonal variation in fuel use. In the shorter one, we kind of abridged it to just a few questions to capture whether or not it's an issue. If you know that seasonal fuel use is sort of like a prominent feature in your customer base, then I guess there's a few things you could do. Like you could repeat the survey at different times of year. That would be one way of trying to capture that variation in fuel use. Or, it's your survey to adapt. You can add more questions about it.
Great. A question on, so do you know what sort of changes were made to the test projects once the stacking data had been compiled? Was there any follow-up on the effectiveness of these changes? So I believe that's maybe for BBox and MGAS work that you did.
So yeah, so I think this is kind of why I talked more about the BBox example than the MGAS example, because the MGAS example was bigger, but we sort of stopped short at asking questions and we didn't action any of the interventions. With BBox, as I discussed earlier, we sort of used the insights from the survey to design this intervention, which we tested. And following that, BBox decided that they were going to distribute pressure cookers and chapati pans to all of their new pay-as-you-go LPG customers in Western Kenya. But having made that decision, for various reasons, BBox then stopped recruiting new pay-as-you-go LPG customers in Western Kenya. So, kind of the executive decision was made to action the results, but then for various programmatic reasons, it didn't end up happening.
Yeah, I think that's part of also why we're like interested in providing support to companies, because we know that this data is just one of the pieces of information that you might use to make different strategic decisions. So we want to be as supportive as we can, but we understand that there's a lot of complex factors that affect your sort of strategic decisions that you might make based on this data. Are there any data or discussions regarding the possible alternatives to quantify the fuel stack, in parentheses, meals cooked, last time used, or energy, in your recent publications?
I've had lots of discussions about it. It isn't written up in any of my publications. For the version of the fuel stacking tool that's provided through the CCA, as I already explained, we went for the last time that you used a cooking fuel or technology. Just a bit simpler, quicker to ask participants. Like people seem to find it easier to answer that question than the question of like, on average, how often do you use each cooking device in your household? But yeah, I agree that there's scope to build up some more knowledge there.
All right, we have a question from John Leary at MEX. Congrats to Tosh for her insightful research and packaging them in an accessible way. In your research, did you also look at interventions that can increase stacking of clean fuels as another pathway to decreasing stacking with polluting fuels?
No, we didn't. But I think that is very much the direction that clean cooking intervention should be moving in. I think John and I have had lots of discussions about this previously as well. So I think this builds upon conversations that we've already had. But yeah, there's lots of scope for different clean cooking fuels and appliances to be complementary to each other. So, you know, electric pressure cookers can be paired with like induction stoves or LPG stoves to produce a clean fuel stack, similar to the one that I kind of mentioned that I use in my flat in Edinburgh. So no, I think that's a really interesting like avenue for future research though.
And I think a related question, I don't know if you have more to say on this or not, is that the tool emphasizes reducing fuel stacking. And is reduction the ultimate goal of the tool? Is fuel stacking inherently considered an undesirable behavior that should be minimized? Or does the tool also consider transitioning to a clean stack?
The tool is really kind of focused on like how do we get a target population to use an appliance or technology that we've given them more, because I think that's what most kind of providers want at the moment. I think that in the future, the goal is to move towards a clean stack. And for that, we would need to think about a different set of questions because this is really focused on polluting fuel stacking. I also think that's the reality of, you know, a lot of the clean cooking contexts in which people are working at the moment.
Great. Just a few more questions so far, but there's still a bit more time if there's any last questions to add. Um, do you have any problems with customers not wanting to speak with enumerators or not being willing to be surveyed?
No, if they don't want to speak to enumerators, then you know, it should be their choice about whether or not they give you their time. I discussed incentives in the user guide, although I didn't mention it in the presentation. So with MGAS, we gave participants like 100 shillings, I think like $1. We made them a mobile money transfer after we'd conducted the survey with them. And that's just to thank them for their time, because, you know, people's time is worth money. So that can help to increase participation. And we actually, before we made the decision to use the incentive, we did a little pilot where we saw what the response rate was without the incentive and with the incentive, and the incentive really kind of did help. So that's something that you can do to try and increase participation, but you know, an end user should always be free to say, no, I don't want to talk to you about this.
Thank you. And then in
I should say
Zambia,
at the beginning of the survey, there is like, we have written like a mini informed consent, few paragraphs, to make sure that the participant understands why they're giving, you know, their data away to you, and also gives them the choice about, in a very clear way, about whether or not they want to do that. Sorry, April.
no. Um, we have a question about in Zambia, the need for cooking alternatives has been hiked up by the massive power outages, causing both the rural and urban areas needing to be efficient cookers, and connectivity via the internet is adversely impacted. How can this tool help if one is offline for 24 hours?
Um, well, I guess that the tool isn't going to help with that, but what the tool is intended to do is to collect those kinds of insights. So obviously with the large power cuts in Zambia, e-cooking appliances are not going to be anyone's cooking appliance of choice. But like you said, because there are also outages on the mobile phone network that can affect other cooking technologies as well. So I think we have a question about that explicitly in the survey. So it's just trying to uncover those sorts of reasons that stop people from using a clean cooking device, I guess.
Great. Okay, there's one question I'm going to answer, which is whether CCA support is limited to meter devices only. It is not. We think it would be interesting to work with companies who have meter devices for this, but we are open to any clean cooking company partners on this. So just please reach out and we can discuss whether it makes sense for us to work together. Okay, we just got another question. We're kind of towards the bottom of our questions, everyone. So yeah, put in any last questions, and Dr. Perros, there's just a few more questions. From your research, what interventions could be explored for fuel destacking?
Destacking. I'm not quite sure I understand what that phrase means. So maybe whoever wrote that question can clarify and then we can come back to it.
I think, I mean, yes, please clarify if that was your question. I just put it in the other category, so I can't see who it was. Um, but maybe you can speak just broadly to some of the different interventions that can be explored to reduce fuel stacking.
Yeah, really dependent on the context. And I would say that for various reasons, this has only been piloted with pay-as-you-go LPG so far, which does make it a little bit limited, and in East Africa. So certainly in East Africa, the preference to cook these long boiling foods on polluting fuels that is quite persistent. So foods like beans, githeri, which is like a maize and bean stew that they eat in Kenya. Preferences to cook foods like ugali because of the need to sort of mash it. It doesn't like, the pot stability on some clean cooking devices isn't so high. Affordability interventions. So stuff like, so pay-as-you-go LPG is already actually in itself addressing lots of those barriers because it allows you to buy fuel in small amounts. So these are kind of some of the things that were revealed in our training, in our work so far. Making technical improvements to the stove and the meter so that, it kind of functions in the way that it should do, making sure that fuel is consistently available, sort of lots of different things. And I would urge you to have a look at the user guide and at the table where we've written up a load of suggestions so far.
Great. And the person who posed that question said yes, destacking was reducing fuel stacking.
Okay.
I liked I liked that term, but I see how it
I
could
did
be
then, yeah.
interpreted to be something a new approach. Um, all right, and then these two questions are from the same participant, and so I'm going to read them together, and because I think they're maybe related, but a few kind of technical questions about the survey, implementing the survey. So one is a follow-up on the seasonal variation. It says we need to capture that. I think for the clear methodology. So I don't know if that's something, Tosh, you want to comment on or not. And then another question is around, is there any provision of taking a picture of the cooking area as evidence that is required by the user survey for GS, which might be gold standard here?
Yeah, okay. So these questions relate to using this survey as part of a carbon project, I think. Hence the reference to the clear methodology and to taking a picture. So in the spreadsheet version that we provided, we have not included a provision to take a picture, but you can edit that yourself. So you can add the functionality to take a picture if you are going in person to households to do so. And then the question about the clear methodology with the seasonal variation. So currently, I think there's just one question about this. Like I said, you could add more questions to more closely tie the survey to the clear methodology. And this is actually something that April and I had been discussing. This survey was developed before the clear methodology came out, but I think there are ways in which it could be tied a bit more closely to the methodology so that it is used as part of the monitoring and evaluation. And that might be something that we can look at. So if anyone on this call has ideas about how a few questions could be added to the survey in order to make it more broadly usable, then please get in touch and we can have a chat about that.
Great. Okay, I'm going to take this question as the last question. So if there's anything else, please feel free to send us an email after the webinar, and we're happy to respond to you. But our last question is, what strategies can be used to select the sample group for the surveys? Is it completely random, or can geographical and contextual differences be taken into account?
Yeah, so what I kind of going back to my suggestion, so random cluster sampling or clustered random sampling. Anyway, you identify the clusters, which are basically the groups that you want to consider separately because for some reason you've got a hunch that they might be cooking differently. So I think that would refer to I forget the wording of the question, the different sort of geographies that you mentioned. And then within that kind of cluster, you then want to sample randomly. You could, I mean, you could do something a bit more complicated if you think that there's good justification too. So with the MGAS survey, so MGAS collect data on how much fuel people use. So we actually kind of use that data to stratify according to fuel use. So we had a group of users who use very little gas. We had like a medium group of gas users and a high group of gas users. And for the sake of the research study, we like split that 1300 between the three groups so that we had coverage of different levels of gas use. So you can do more complicated things like that, but you know, the more like clusters that you use, basically the more surveys that you need to do. So the resource requirements of the project go up. So it's all a bit of a balance between knowing your customers or your participants, knowing their characteristics, and then looking at what resources you have to conduct the surveys in the first place. Because if all you can do is 100 surveys, then clustering doesn't really make any sense because your groups get too small. So sorry, a bit of an unclear answer, but I guess that's part of the reason why we're providing some support to some companies.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Perros, for all of your time in this area of research in general, and then also on today's webinar and answering all those questions. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for your clapping hands. And there were a few in the Q&A. There were a lot of thank yous to you, Dr. Perros. So thank you everyone though for participating, and please get in touch. Right now, the user guide is up on CCA's website, and we'll be happy to send that along as a follow-up from the webinar. And then we're just asking that companies or partners interested in seeing the full toolkit send us an email at this userinsights@cleancooking.org to get the full access to the other pieces of the tool, just because we want to have some understanding of how people are using it and who's interested. But it's certainly open to anyone. We're happy to share it with anyone. So without further comments by me, it's the end of the hour, and thank you again for joining us, and we hope to be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.